hello. Today, we delve into a case that remains one of the most disturbing and unsettling in the history, criming the story of Albert Fish. This name, once uttered, conjures images so grotesque, so profoundly disturbing, that they seem to belong to the realm of fiction rather than reality. Yet, the chilling truth is that Albert Fish was very real. A predator who stalked the streets of New York during the early 1900s, his seemingly harmless exterior masking a soul of unimaginable darkness. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a monster disguised as a frail old man, preying on the innocence of children. The crimes he perpetrated were not merely acts of violence, but a descent into a depravity so profound it tested the limits of human understanding. We will explore the harrowing details of his acts, the lives he shattered, and the terror he inflicted. This journey will take us through a labyrinth of horror, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can reside behind the most unassuming facade. Brace yourselves, as we are about to uncover the horrifying saga of Albert Fish, a name that will forever be synonymous with the darkest recesses of the human psyche. Part 2. The Descent into Darkness. The Crimes of Albert Fish. The story of Albert Fish is not merely a list of atrocities. It's a terrifying odyssey into the darkest corners of the human psyche, a descent into a depravity so profound it seems to defy the very laws of nature. To understand the monster, we must first understand the man, or rather, the warped and twisted caricature of a man he became. Born Hamilton Howard Fish in 1870, his early life was riddled with instability and trauma. Orphaned at a young age, he was subjected to the harsh realities of 19th century orphanages, environments often rife with abuse and neglect. It was within these bleak walls that the seeds of his future horrors may have been sown. Some speculate that the cruelty he witnessed, and perhaps endured, warped his young mind, twisting his perceptions of pain, pleasure, and morality. However, attributing his later actions solely to childhood trauma would be an oversimplification, a dangerous dismissal of the sheer agency behind his evil. Fish himself, in his later confessions, often cited religious delusions and a perverse desire for suffering, both his own and that of others, as driving forces. He spoke of hearing voices, of believing himself to be a prophet, a vessel for a twisted form of divine punishment. These claims, while potentially indicative of a deeply disturbed mind, also served to further obfuscate the true nature of his motivations. His first documented forays into the realm of violence, though, were not yet murderous. They manifested as acts of self-harm, a disturbing prelude to the horrors he would later inflict on others. He engaged in self-flagellation, inserting needles into his groin and even burning himself with hot pokers. These acts were not merely masochistic, they were, in Fish's own twisted logic, a form of purification, a way to cleanse himself of perceived sins. This is where his story begins to truly veer into the grotesque. In his confessions, he wrote about sending anonymous letters to people. The contents of those letters were about his perversion, his desire to torture and kill. The case of Grace Budd. A descent into the unthinkable. The case that would forever cement Albert Fish's name in the annals of infamy. The crime that would expose the true depths of his depravity was the abduction and murder of Grace Budd in 1928. This was not his first murder, but it was the one that unraveled his carefully constructed facade of normalcy, revealing the monster that lurked beneath. Grace Budd was a 10-year-old girl, a child full of life and innocence, living with her family in a bustling New York City. Fish, presenting himself as a kindly farmer named Frank Howard, befriended the Budd family under false pretenses. He gained their trust, weaving a web of lies about a non-existent job opportunity for Grace's older brother, Edward. He painted himself as a benevolent figure, a friend in need, a lifeline in the harsh realities of the Great Depression. On June 3, 1928, Fish arrived at the Budd residence, ostensibly to take Edward to this supposed job. However, he convinced the family to let Grace accompany them to a supposed children's party at his sister's house, a fabrication that would seal the young girl's fate. This seemingly innocuous request, a trip to a party, masked a sinister intent that would soon be revealed in all its horrific detail. Grace, dressed in her Sunday best, excitedly left with Frank Howard, completely unaware of the darkness that awaited her. She waved goodbye to her family, a poignant image that would later haunt them for the rest of their lives. That wave, that innocent farewell, was the last time the Budds would ever see their daughter alive. Fish took Grace not to a party, but to an abandoned house in Westchester County, a desolate place called Wisteria Cottage, a name that would forever be tainted by the horrors that transpired within its walls. There, far from prying eyes, far from any hope of rescue, Fish subjected Grace to unimaginable torment. He later recounted these acts in chilling detail, his words painting a picture so gruesome, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it's difficult to comprehend how one human being could inflict such suffering on another, let alone a child. He strangled Grace, dismembered her body, and then, in an act that defies all reason and decency, he cooked and consumed parts of her remains over a period of 9 days. This was not merely murder. It was a descent into a cannibalistic savagery that shattered every societal norm, every moral code. The sheer brutality of this act, the calculated and prolonged nature of it, speaks to a level of depravity rarely encountered, even in the darkest annals of criminal history. When he had finished, he disposed of what little remained of Grace in a nearby area. The discovery of these remains, though tragic, would eventually become a crucial piece of evidence in bringing Fish to justice. A testament to the meticulous work of the investigators who refused to let this monstrous act go unpunished. The letters, a taunting trail of terror, 6 years after Grace Budd's disappearance. Her mother, Delia, received a letter. It was unsigned, but the contents were unmistakable, a chilling echo of the horror that had befallen her daughter. The letter, penned in Fish's distinctive handwriting, detailed the abduction and murder of Grace in graphic detail. It was a taunt, a cruel boast from a killer who reveled in the suffering he had caused. The letter described how he had lured Grace to her death, how he had killed her, and the unspeakable acts he had committed afterward. It was a confession, a horrific window into the mind of a monster. For Delia Budd, it was a reopening of a wound that had never truly healed, a confirmation of her worst fears. But why would Fish write such a letter? Why would he risk exposure by revealing such damning details? Some believe it was an act of pure sadism, a way to further torment the grieving family. Others suggest it was a manifestation of his deep-seated need for attention, a twisted desire to be recognized for his work. Perhaps, in his deluded mind, he saw himself as an artist of evil, and the letter was his signature on a masterpiece of horror. Regardless of his motivations, the letter proved to be a crucial turning point in the investigation. It provided investigators with a tangible link to Fish, a piece of evidence that would eventually lead to his capture. It also served to further galvanize public outrage, transforming Fish from a suspected killer into a national symbol of evil, a boogeyman whose name struck fear into the hearts of parents across the country. The letter was analyzed, the handwriting scrutinized, and a distinctive watermark was discovered. A small detail that would ultimately prove to be Fish's undoing. This seemingly insignificant clue, a testament to the meticulousness of forensic science, would eventually lead investigators to a rooming house where Fish had once resided, and to a stationery store where he had purchased the paper. A trail of victims, unmasking a serial predator. The investigation into Grace Budd's murder opened a Pandora's box of horrors, revealing that Fish was not merely a one-time killer, but a serial predator who had been operating for years, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered families in his wake. His confessions, though often rambling and filled with religious delusions, painted a terrifying picture of a man who had been preying on the vulnerable for decades. He admitted to killing at least 5 other children, though some estimates place the number of his victims much higher, possibly in the hundreds. The exact number remains unknown, lost in the fog of time and the chaotic nature of Fish's confessions. He targeted children from impoverished backgrounds, children who were often overlooked, children whose disappearances might not have been immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. He was a phantom moving through the shadows, exploiting the vulnerabilities of a society grappling with economic hardship and social upheaval. He described his methods, his techniques for luring children, his preferred methods of killing. Each story was more disturbing than the last, each revelation further solidifying his status as a monster of unparalleled depravity. He spoke of burying some of his victims, of discarding others in remote locations, their bodies never to be found. One of his confirmed victims was 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. He was playing with his friends near his home in 1927 when fish lured him away. He took him to an abandoned house, murdered him, and buried the body nearby. Another known victim was Francis McDonnell, a boy he kidnapped and murdered in 1924. The details of his murder are scarce, shrouded in the same darkness that surrounds much of Fish's early criminal activity. However, what little is known points to the same pattern of abduction, torture, and murder that characterized his later crimes. These are just fragments of a larger, more horrifying picture, glimpses into the reign of terror that Albert Fish inflicted upon an unsuspecting society. Each victim, a life cut short, a future stolen, a family forever scarred. The sheer number of potential victims, the vast expanse of time over which he operated, makes the full extent of his crimes almost impossible to grasp. He was a predator who moved like a ghost through the underbelly of society, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable suffering that continues to haunt us to this day. The capturing. A web of evidence closes. In the investigation into Albert Fish was a complex and painstaking process, a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officials who refused to give up on bringing this monster to justice. They were working in an era before advanced forensic techniques, relying on meticulous detective work, witness testimonies, and the careful analysis of the few pieces of physical evidence they had. The discovery of Grace Budd's remains, coupled with the chilling details contained in the anonymous letter, provided the crucial breakthrough. Investigators were able to trace the letter back to Fish through the watermark on the stationery, a seemingly insignificant detail that proved to be his undoing. This was a testament to the power of observation, the importance of even the smallest clue in unraveling complex cases. Once they had a name, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. They tracked him to a rooming house in New York City, where he had been living under an assumed name. The landlady, upon seeing a photograph of Fish, immediately recognized him as a former tenant, a man who had always seemed a bit odd, a bit unsettling, but never someone she would have suspected of such heinous crimes. On December 13, 1934, after a 6-year manhunt, Albert Fish was finally apprehended. He was found in a rundown apartment, a shadow of his former self. surrounded by religious pamphlets and newspaper clippings about his own crimes. He did not resist arrest, almost seeming relieved that his reign of terror had finally come to an end. His capture was a major news event, a moment of collective relief for a nation that had been gripped by fear. Newspapers across the country carried the story on their front pages, detailing the capture of the boogeyman, the werewolf of Wisteria, the man who had come to embody the darkest fears of every parent. But the capture was only the beginning. What followed was a trial that would captivate the nation, a courtroom drama that would expose the full extent of Fish's depravity to a horrified public. The trial was not about determining guilt. Fish readily confessed to his crimes. It was about determining his sanity, a question that continues to be debated to this day. Was he a madman, driven by forces beyond his control, or was he a cold, calculating killer who was fully aware of the horrific nature of his actions? This was the central question that the jury, and indeed the nation, grappled with as the trial unfolded, a question that would determine the fate of Albert Fish. Part 3G. The trial and aftermath. Our nation grapples with unfathomable evil. Expanded. The trial of Albert Fish was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a public exorcism, a collective attempt to purge the nation of a terrifying evil that had seeped into its consciousness. The courtroom became a crucible, a focal point for the anxieties and fears of a society grappling with the Great Depression, a time when the veneer of civilization seemed particularly thin. Every day, the courtroom was packed to the rafters, a sea of faces reflecting a morbid fascination, a desperate need to understand how such depravity could exist within their seemingly ordered world. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a mixture of horror, disgust, and a strange, unsettling curiosity. Reporters, their pens scratching furiously on their notepads, became the chroniclers of this macabre spectacle, transmitting every gruesome detail to a nation hungry for answers, eager to see the face of evil and perhaps, in doing so, to reassure themselves that it could be contained. A courtroom dramague. The battle of experts and the weight of depravity. The trial itself was a theatrical display of legal maneuvering and psychological warfare. The defense, led by the seasoned attorney James Dempsey, a man known for his sharp wit and courtroom prowess, faced a task as daunting as scaling a sheer cliff face. They could not dispute the horrific facts laid out by the prosecution. Fish's own confessions, rambling and riddled with disturbing details, had already painted a vivid and undeniable picture of his guilt. Instead, Dempsey chose to navigate the treacherous waters of an insanity defense, arguing that Fish was a man so thoroughly consumed by mental illness that he was adrift in a sea of delusion, incapable of understanding the moral implications of his actions. Dempsey paraded a series of expert witnesses before the court, psychiatrists who, with their clinical language and detailed analyses, attempted to dissect Fish's fractured psyche. They spoke of a man tormented by inner demons, a man who heard voices, who believed himself to be a prophet on a divine, albeit twisted, mission. They testified to his history of self-harm, the needles he inserted into his body, the burning pokers he applied to his flesh, acts he claimed were a form of religious purification. They delved into his traumatic childhood, the brutal realities of orphanage life in the late 19th century, suggesting that these early experiences had sown the seeds of his later depravity, twisting his perceptions of pain, pleasure, and human connection. Dr. Frederick Wortham, a prominent psychiatrist and a controversial figure in his own right, took the stand as a key witness for the defense. Wortham, known for his outspoken views on the impact of violence in media, particularly comic books, on young minds, presented a complex diagnosis of Fish's mental state. He argued that Fish suffered from a constellation of severe mental illnesses, schizophrenia, characterized by hallucinations and delusions, paranoia, a deep-seated distrust and suspicion of others, and a profound form of sadomasochism, a condition where sexual gratification is linked to the infliction and reception of pain. He painted a picture of Fish as a psychotic personality, a man detached from reality, adrift in a world of his own making, a world governed by twisted logic and perverse desires. The defense's strategy was a delicate and controversial one. They sought to humanize Fish, to elicit a degree of pity, perhaps even a sliver of understanding, from the jury. They attempted to shift the narrative, portraying him not as a cold-blooded monster, but as a deeply disturbed individual, a victim of his own fractured mind, a man in desperate need of help rather than punishment. This approach, however, was a risky gamble, a tightrope walk over a chasm of public outrage. Given the sheer brutality, the calculated cruelty, and the horrific details of Fish's crimes, convincing the jury to see him as anything other than a monster was a monumental challenge. The prosecution's furing, painting a portrait of unadulterated evil, District Attorney Elbert Gallagher, a man with a reputation for fierce determination and unwavering dedication to justice, led the prosecution's charge. He and his team vehemently opposed the insanity plea, portraying it as a cynical ploy to evade responsibility, a legal loophole that should not be afforded to a man who had committed such unspeakable acts. Gallagher presented his own cadre of expert witnesses, psychiatrists who, while acknowledging Fish's mental peculiarities, firmly asserted that he was not legally insane. They argued that he possessed a clear understanding of the difference between right and wrong, that he was capable of planning and executing his crimes with meticulous precision, and that his confessions while bizarre and disturbing, also revealed a cunning mind aware of the consequences of his actions. The prosecution meticulously dissected Fish's methods, highlighting the calculated nature of his crimes. They emphasized the elaborate lies he spun to gain the trust of his victims and their families. The way he presented himself as a kindly, grandfatherly figure, a wolf in the most unassuming of sheep's clothing. They detailed the steps he took to cover his tracks, the disposal of bodies, the attempts to mislead investigators. They argued that his confessions, far from being the ramblings of a madman, were a deliberate attempt to shock and horrify, a perverse form of bragging, a testament to his pride and his gruesome work. Gallagher, in his impassioned addresses to the jury, focused on the sheer cruelty of Fish's actions, the unimaginable suffering he inflicted upon innocent children, and the devastating, irreparable damage he caused to their families. He reminded the jury of the victims, their stolen futures, their extinguished laughter, their families' unending grief. He sought to strip away any semblance of humanity that the defense might have attempted to weave around Fish, to ensure that the jury saw him for what he truly was: the embodiment of pure, unadulterated evil, a predator who deserved not pity, but the full force of the law. The jury's verdict, a nation's expectation, and the weight of decision. After weeks of harrowing testimony, graphic evidence, and conflicting expert opinions, the fate of Albert Fish rested in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. They retired to the jury room, carrying with them the weight of a nation's expectations. The burden of delivering justice for the victims and their families, and the immense responsibility of deciding whether a man was mad or simply evil. The deliberations were undoubtedly long and arduous, the jurors grappling with the complex psychological arguments, the disturbing details of the crimes, and the profound moral implications of their decision. They were tasked with navigating a legal labyrinth, with determining the often blurred line between mental illness and moral culpability. They were asked to decide whether a man who had committed such unspeakable acts was a product of a diseased mind, or simply a monster who had chosen to embrace his darkest impulses. Finally, after hours of deliberation, a hush fell over the courtroom as the jury filed back in, their faces etched with the gravity of their decision. The foreman rose, his voice trembling slightly as he delivered the verdict that a nation had been holding its breath for guilty. The jury had rejected the insanity plea, concluding that Fish, while undeniably mentally disturbed, was legally responsible for the horrific acts he had committed. He was sentenced to death, a verdict that was met with a mixture of solemn relief, a sense of grim satisfaction, and perhaps a lingering unease about the nature of evil itself. The execution, a final, unsettling chapter on January 16, 1936. The execution of Albert Fish was carried out in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison, a grim fortress overlooking the Hudson River. The event was shrouded in an atmosphere of morbid anticipation, a sense that a dark chapter in American history was finally drawing to a close. Reporters from across the country gathered to witness the final act, their presence a testament to the enduring fascination with this case, with this man who had come to embody the darkest recesses of the human psyche. Fish, true to his bizarre and unsettling nature, showed no remorse in his final hours. He remained impassive, almost detached, as he was led to the death chamber. Some accounts suggest that he even seemed eager to meet his fate, perhaps clinging to his delusional belief that he was a martyr, that his death was a form of divine retribution, a necessary sacrifice. His last words, depending on which account one chooses to believe, were either a chillingly mundane, "I don't even know why I'm here," or a more religiously tinged statement reflecting his warped faith. These final utterances, ambiguous and open to interpretation, only served to further solidify his enigmatic persona, leaving those who witnessed his execution with a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that they had glimpsed into an abyss they could never fully comprehend. He showed no remorse, no fear, no regret. Some in attendance reported that he seemed almost to relish the moment, perhaps believing he was headed to a perverse form of salvation, a twisted afterlife tailored to his unique brand of depravity. The execution itself was swift and, by all accounts, uneventful. The switch was thrown, the current surged, and Albert Fish, the boogeyman, the werewolf of Wisteria, was no more. His death marked the definitive end of a reign of terror that had haunted the nation. A moment of closure for the families of his victims, a sense that justice, however delayed and however imperfect, had ultimately been served. The aftermath, scars on the psyche and a legacy of fear, but the execution of Albert Fish did not erase the scars he had left on the American psyche. His name remained etched in the annals of true crime, a synonym for evil, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. His story continued to be told and retold, analyzed and debated. A cautionary tale that continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. A dark mirror reflecting the anxieties and fears of a society grappling with the complexities of human nature. The case of Albert Fish had a profound and lasting impact on American society, influencing everything from popular culture to criminal justice. It led to an increased awareness of child safety issues, prompting changes in how law enforcement investigated cases of missing children, and highlighting the need for greater vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. It also sparked a national conversation about the relationship between mental illness and the death penalty. a debate that continues to rage on, unresolved and deeply divisive. To this very day, forensic psychologists and criminologists continue to pore over the details of the case, using it as a chilling case study in the depths of human depravity, an example of the darkest extremes of psychopathic behavior. His confessions, his letters, his bizarre courtroom demeanor, all became fodder for analysis, an attempt to understand the motivations, the thought processes, the twisted logic that could drive a man to commit such unspeakable acts. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Albert Fish was the fear he instilled in a generation of parents. He became the ultimate boogeyman, a figure whose name was whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale used to frighten children into obedience. His crimes shattered the illusion of safety, the comforting belief that evil was something that existed out there, in the shadows, and not in the guise of a kindly old man living just down the street. He reminded everyone that monsters were not always mythical creatures with fangs and claws. Sometimes they were the people next door, the seemingly harmless individuals encountered every day, hidden in plain sight, their darkness masked by a veneer of normalcy. The story of Albert Fish is a dark and disturbing one, a journey into the abyss of human nature, an exploration of the darkest corners of the human soul. It's a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil is not always a distant, abstract concept. It can reside within us, within our neighbors, within our communities. It's a story that reminds us to be vigilant, to protect the innocent, to never underestimate the capacity for darkness that lurks within the human heart. The echoes of his crimes still resonate today, a chilling reminder that the potential for such horrors remains a shadow that stretches across time, a warning that we must never forget the lessons learned from this dark and disturbing chapter in American history. We can only hope that by understanding this darkness, by confronting it head-on, by studying the factors that contribute to such depravity, we can perhaps, in some small way, prevent such horrors from ever happening again, that we can build a society where such evil finds no purchase, where innocence is protected, and where the monsters among us are identified and stopped before they can unleash their terror upon the world. The task is daunting, the challenge immense, but the memory of Albert Fish and his victims demands that we try. Part 4G. A deep dive into the mind of a monster. The psychopathology of Albert Fish, understanding the crimes of Albert Fish, necessitates venturing into the labyrinthine corridors of his mind. A journey fraught with disturbing realities and perplexing contradictions. To merely label him a monster, while emotionally satisfying, does little to illuminate the psychological mechanisms that fueled his depravity. To comprehend the why behind his actions, we must delve into the murky realm of psychopathology, attempting to dissect the complex interplay of factors that transformed a seemingly ordinary man into one of history's most notorious serial killers. A diagnostic puzzle egg, untangling the threads of mental illness. Diagnosing Albert Fish posthumously is a complex and speculative endeavor. Modern psychiatry relies on direct observation, interviews, and a battery of psychological tests, none of which are available to us in this case. We are left to piece together a fragmented picture based on historical records, witness testimonies, and most importantly, Fish's own disturbing confessions and letters. These sources, while valuable, are also problematic. Fish was a known liar, a manipulator, and his accounts were often laced with religious delusions and attempts to shock and horrify. Therefore, any attempt to diagnose him must be approached with caution, acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge and the inherent subjectivity of interpreting historical data through a modern lens. Nevertheless, the available evidence strongly suggests that Fish suffered from a constellation of severe mental disorders. Several diagnoses have been proposed over the years, each attempting to capture a different facet of his multifaceted psychopathology. Let's examine some of the most prominent contenders. 1. Sadomasochism, the confluence of pain and pleasure. The most obvious and perhaps most defining feature of Fish's psychological profile was his profound sadomasochism. This disorder, characterized by the intertwining of sexual gratification with the infliction and reception of pain, manifested in both his self-harming behaviors and the horrific torture he inflicted upon his victims. Fish's confessions are replete with descriptions of self-inflicted pain, from inserting needles into his groin to burning himself with hot pokers. He often framed these acts within a religious context, claiming they were a form of penance or purification. However, the sheer intensity and frequency of these behaviors suggest a deeper, more primal drive, a craving for pain that went beyond any religious rationale. His sadism, the counterpart to his masochism, was directed outwards towards his victims, particularly children. He derived pleasure, likely sexual in nature, from inflicting unimaginable suffering upon them. The prolonged torture, the dismemberment, the cannibalism, all point to a deep-seated need to dominate, control, and ultimately destroy his victims in the most horrific way possible. It's crucial to understand that sadomasochism, in Fish's case, was not merely a sexual preference. It was a core component of his identity, a driving force behind his actions. It was the lens through which he viewed the world, the framework through which he interacted with others. His sadomasochistic impulses were not compartmentalized. They permeated every aspect of his being, ultimately leading him down a path of unimaginable horror. 2. Paraphilic disorders, a spectrum of deviant desires beyond sadomasochism. Fish likely suffered from a range other paraphilic disorders, further complicating his already convoluted psychological profile. Paraphilias are characterized by intense and persistent sexual interests directed towards atypical objects, situations, or individuals. In Fish's case, several paraphilias likely played a role in his crimes. Pedophilia, his targeting of children, particularly prepubescent children, strongly suggests pedophilia, a paraphilia characterized by a sexual attraction to children. This was not merely a preference. It was a compulsion, a driving force that led him to seek out and prey upon the most vulnerable members of society. Gerontophilian. Some have suggested that Fish may have also harbored gerontophilic tendencies, a sexual attraction to elderly individuals. This is based on his own advanced age and his occasional references to older individuals in his writings. However, this remains speculative and less central to his crimes than his pedophilia, coprophilia, and urophilia. Fish's confessions and letters contain disturbing references to feces and urine, suggesting a possible fascination with these substances. While not directly linked to his murders, these paraphilias further highlight the extent of his deviance and the breakdown of normal inhibitions. Picarisming. This paraphilia involves deriving sexual pleasure from piercing the skin of another person with sharp objects, such as needles or knives. Fish's history of inserting needles into his own body and his use of sharp instruments in the torture and dismemberment of his victims strongly suggest picarism as significant component of his psychopathology. These paraphilias, operating in concert, created a toxic brew of deviant desires that fueled Fish's predatory behavior. They warped his perception of sexuality, blurring the lines between pleasure, pain, and violence. They transformed him into a hunter, constantly seeking out new victims to satisfy his insatiable and increasingly bizarre cravings. 3. Psychopathio-antisocial personality disorder, the absence of empathy. While the term psychopath was not in common usage during Fish's lifetime, many modern experts believe he would likely meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. ASPD, the current diagnostic term that encompasses many features of psychopathy. ASPD is characterized by a pervasive disregard for the rights of others, a lack of empathy, a pattern of deceitfulness and manipulation, and a failure to conform to social norms. Fish exhibited many of the hallmark traits of ASPD: lack of remorse throughout his confessions and his trial. Fish displayed a chilling lack of remorse for his actions. He seemed incapable of understanding or acknowledging the suffering he had caused. He often spoke of his victims in a detached, almost clinical manner, as if they were objects rather than human beings. Deceitfulness and manipulation. He was a skilled liar and manipulator, able to convincingly portray himself as a harmless old man to gain the trust of his victims and their families. He used elaborate ruses, fabricated stories, and a carefully crafted persona to lure his victims into his trap. Impulsivity and irresponsibility, his nomadic lifestyle, his frequent changes of identity, and his inability to hold down a steady job all point to a pattern of impulsivity and irresponsibility. He seemed to drift through life, driven by his immediate desires, with little regard for the consequences of his actions. Callousness and lack of empathy, perhaps the most defining characteristic of ASPD, and one that fish exhibited in abundance, is a profound lack of empathy. He seemed utterly incapable of understanding or sharing the feelings of others. He viewed his victims not as human beings with their own lives and emotions, but as mere objects to be used and discarded. This lack of empathy was not merely a personal failing. It was a core component of his pathology, a fundamental deficit that allowed him to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty without experiencing any moral qualms. It was the psychological bedrock upon which his entire edifice of depravity was built. 4. Schizophrenial psychotic disorder, a break from reality. The defense team in Fish's trial argued that he suffered from schizophrenia, a severe mental illness characterized by hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and a general detachment from reality. While the jury ultimately rejected this defense, the question of whether Fish experienced psychotic episodes remains a subject of debate. Some aspects of Fish's behavior do suggest a possible psychotic. Componenty religious delusions. He often spoke of hearing voices, of believing himself to be a prophet or a biblical figure. He interpreted his actions through a distorted religious lens, claiming they were a form of divine punishment or a necessary sacrifice. These delusions, while potentially a product of his sadomasochistic desires, could also be indicative of a psychotic break from reality. Disorganized thinking, his confessions, and letters are often rambling, incoherent, and filled with bizarre and illogical statements. This could be interpreted as evidence of disorganized thinking, a hallmark symptom of schizophrenia. However, other aspects of Fish's behavior argue against a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Calculated planning, his crimes were not the impulsive acts of a man in the throes of a psychotic episode. They were carefully planned, meticulously executed, and involved a degree of cunning and foresight that seems incompatible with severe schizophrenia. Awareness of wrongdoing. While he may have rationalized his actions through religious delusions, Fish clearly understood that what he was doing was illegal and morally reprehensible. He took steps to conceal his crimes, to evade capture, and to manipulate those around him, suggesting a degree of awareness that contradicts a complete break from reality. Therefore, while Fish may have experienced some psychotic symptoms, particularly related to his religious delusions, it's unlikely that he suffered from full full-blown schizophrenia. His crimes were too organized, too calculated, and too driven by his underlying paraphilias to be solely attributed to a psychotic disorder. It's more probable that his religious delusions were intertwined with his sadomasochistic desires, providing a framework for him to rationalize and justify his horrific actions. The nature ves, nurture debatic, forging a monster. The question of what factors contributed to the development of Fisch's extreme psychopathology is a complex one. Raising the age-old debate of nature versus nurture. Was he born with a predisposition towards violence and defiance, or were these traits forged in the crucible of his traumatic childhood? The nurture argument, the impact of early trauma. There's no doubt that Fisch's early life was filled with hardship and trauma. Orphaned at a young age, he was subjected to the harsh realities of 19th century orphanages, institutions often characterized by neglect, abuse, and a general lack of emotional support. It's highly probable that he witnessed and perhaps experienced physical and emotional abuse within these environments. These early experiences could have had a profound impact on his developing brain, shaping his perceptions of the world and his relationships with others. Trauma, particularly during childhood, can disrupt the development of empathy, attachment, and emotional regulation. It can create a sense of fear, distrust, and a deep-seated need for control. In Fisch's case, it's possible that the trauma he endured in his formative years contributed to the development of his sadomasochistic tendencies. The abuse he witnessed or experienced may have become intertwined with his developing sexuality, leading to a distorted association between pain, pleasure, and power. The nature argument. Predisposition to deviance, however, to solely attribute Fisch's psychopathology to his upbringing would be an oversimplification. While trauma can undoubtedly have a significant impact on development, it does not inevitably lead to such extreme forms of violence and defiance. Many individuals endure horrific childhoods without becoming serial killers. This suggests that there may have been other factors at play, perhaps a genetic predisposition towards certain personality traits or mental disorders. While the science of behavioral genetics is still in its infancy, it's plausible that Fisch inherited certain predispositions that, when combined with his traumatic experiences, created a perfect storm of psychopathology. A complex interplaying. The making of a monster. Ultimately, the development of Albert Fisch's psychopathology was likely the result of a complex interplay between nature and nurture. His traumatic childhood undoubtedly played a significant role, shaping his worldview, warping his emotional development, and perhaps laying the foundation for his sadomasochistic tendencies. However, it's probable that he also possessed certain inherent predispositions, perhaps a genetic vulnerability to mental illness or a neurological anomaly that contributed to his lack of empathy and his propensity for violence. It's impossible to say with certainty which factor was more dominant. What we can say is that the combination of these factors created a uniquely dangerous individual, a man whose inner demons drove him to commit acts of unimaginable horror. He was a product of both his environment and his inherent nature, a chilling example of how the darkest aspects of human potential can be unleashed when these forces collide. The uniqueness of evil, why fish remains an outlier, despite the insights gained from analyzing fish's psychopathology. He remains an outlier, an anomaly even within the already extreme world of serial killers. The sheer brutality of his crimes, the extent of his cannibalism, and the disturbing joy he seemed to derive from inflicting pain set him apart from even the most hardened criminals. His case challenges our attempts to categorize and understand human behavior. It reminds us that there are depths of depravity that defy easy explanation, that some individuals seem to operate on a different moral plane, driven by forces that we may never fully comprehend. The enduring legacy, a cautionary tale, and a call for understanding. The case of Albert Fish serves as a chilling cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the potential for darkness that resides within the human psyche. It underscores the importance of early intervention, of identifying and addressing the needs of children who have experienced trauma, of recognizing the warning signs of developing psychopathology. It also highlights the need for continued research into the complex interplay of factors that contribute to extreme violence and defiance. By understanding the biological, psychological, and social forces that shape individuals like Albert Fish, we may be able to develop more effective strategies for prevention, intervention, and treatment. Ultimately, the story of Albert Fish is not just a tale of horror. It's a call for understanding. It's a challenge to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, not with fear and revulsion alone, but with a willingness to delve into the complexities of the human mind, to seek answers to the why behind the horror, and to use that knowledge to build a safer, more compassionate world. The task is daunting, the answers elusive, but the memory of Fish's victims demands that we continue to search for understanding, to strive to prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. Only by confronting the darkness can we hope to find a path towards the light. Part 5: A Legacy of Shadows and the Imperative of Vigilance. The case of Albert Fish, though a relic of a bygone era, casts a long and unsettling shadow into the present. It serves as a stark testament to the capacity for unimaginable cruelty that can reside within a seemingly ordinary human being. While the specifics of Fish's psychopathology may remain shrouded in a degree of speculation, the core elements, the sadomasochism, the paraphilias, the profound lack of empathy, paint a chilling portrait of a predator driven by impulses that most of us can scarcely comprehend. His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that monsters are not always creatures of myth and legend. They can walk among us, hidden in plain sight, their darkness concealed behind a facade of normalcy. This case underscores the vital importance of vigilance, of paying attention to the warning signs, however subtle, that may indicate a dangerous individual in our midst. It highlights the need for robust systems to protect the most vulnerable members of society, particularly children, from those who would prey upon them. Furthermore, it compels us to continue researching the complex interplay of factors biological, psychological, and social that contribute to the development of extreme violence and psychopathy. Only through understanding can we hope to prevent future tragedies and build a world where such horrors become a thing of the past. The legacy of Albert Fish is not just one of horror, but also a call to action, a reminder that the price of complacency is too high to pay. Thank you for joining me on this dark and difficult journey into the abyss. If you found this exploration insightful, please like this video, share it with others who might be interested, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the world of true crime. Your support allows us to continue shedding light on these important, often unsettling, stories. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe.